right back together here. Our next panel is about understanding and protecting traditional knowledge. Together, we're going to explore the complexities surrounding the intersection of Western intellectual property rights and Indigenous traditional knowledge. And you can see some amazing artifacts already on stage here that we'll talk through. But we've got individuals from CCAB, SIIT, and AgriTech North, and you'll learn more about what those are when they're up here in case you don't already know. And they're going to delve into a discussion on traditional knowledge, intellectual property, and resources for Indigenous business. Now, to help guide us, we have a fantastic moderator today. Her name is Diane Roussin. She's with the Winnipeg Boldness project. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Diane, because she's a very impressive woman that's going to come up here right away. Diane is an Anishinaabe community leader who passionately is committed to the pursuit of Mino Bimadzawin, which she taught me recently, and it means the good life. And she's looking for that for all families and all children. She's also a proud member of the Skownan First Nation in Agawidwin in Treaty 2 territory, and currently lives in Winnipeg with many of us. Diane is the project director of the Winnipeg Boldness project. She's an ambitious social innovation initiative, and this is her right here, coming up on stage. And she also has worked tirelessly on initiatives that promote Indigenous peoples, values, and ways of knowing. Diane is also impressive in many other ways. I'm going to tell you a few more. She is a TEDx speaker. She spoke on the topic of Indigenous social innovation. She was awarded a Governor General's Award for Outstanding Indigenous Leadership and is a recipient of the Manitoba Women Trailblazers Award by the Nellie McClung Foundation. So Diane, thank you for gracing us with your presence here on stage, and I will let you take it away.
There we go. Oh, yeah, got it. Miigwech, chi miigwech, Margot. And I was just thanking Margot for taking a run at using some of our traditional language. It's always important for me. And so in any bio or anything that introduces me, I will always put some of those words in there. So, and I appreciate when people actually take the time to learn and pronunciate some of those words, because language reclamation is certainly a huge thing in our communities. So very happy to be here, very excited about this panel. Loved what we heard all of this morning, wonderful stories and inspiring messages. So the bar is set. We have to I'm super competitive too. So, but have had a chance to chat with these superstars, and came away from just our prep meetings super inspired, and I know that what we're going to talk about is just going to inspire you as well. But I do want to start in a way that I know how to start, and it's with gratitude. And so just thanking, obviously, the organizers and Joelle and North Forge for all the wonderful work that the organization does. A little bit biased because I belong to North Forge as well. But to have Grandma Shingoose start us off in that way, and to use the medicines, and to start us with those positive thoughts, and to have Clifford with the song. There's a thing, we're talking about traditional knowledge, and there's this thing called Chibo. I always known it as our energies, but recently an elder told me it's Chibo Wayman. And so the vibrations of the music and of the songs and of I could smell the sage as she was, and we're passing tobacco. When we use all that, it clears our Chibo women, and so it allows us to sit together in a good way, and it clears off some of that other energy that might get in the way of our learning today and our time together today. So want to give gratitude and thanks to starting like that. Now, these guys, these folks, as you can see, and I encourage you to please Google them, please look up what they do, because there's so much more to them that we can cover in today's panel. But another sort of traditional way that we have introduced ourselves is to actually introduce ourselves. So often we will use different items, like different relatives, like eagle feathers or rocks or so on, and pass it around the circle and just introduce ourselves and let people know what we need them to know about ourselves. So we're going to do that today. I don't actually have the thing, but it's going to be virtual. So I'm going to pass it to Cody first. But if our esteemed panel could just tell us what it is you want us to know about you. There's lots to know about you, but what do you want this group to know about you today?
Thanks, Diane. Honestly, I'm really just here to raise awareness about Indigenous businesses and the issues they experience with the IP framework. There's a bit of a disconnect that goes on there. Also here to just raise awareness about CCAB in general and all the support we have for Indigenous businesses. I guess a bit of an intro about myself. My name is Cody Lewis. I'm a public policy associate with the CCAB, Canadian Council for Aboriginal Businesses to Law Inform. Been with them for about 3 years now, after finishing an internship with York University, where I learned all about this stuff, so it's been pretty cool to follow up on that. Also a member of the Halibut First Nation in Western Newfoundland. Yeah, and I guess a bit about CCAB, like we're a national Indigenous nonprofit organization, about 2,200 members nationwide, 2/3 of which are Indigenous businesses like Ben over there. The other third's corporate Canada. But yeah, we have various programs, PAR, which is a certification program for corporations to ensure good Indigenous engagement, I guess, and verify that they do that. Various other supports that I won't get into. We're also turning 40 this year, actually. So May 20th through 29th, we have our big 40th anniversary in Toronto, multi-day event. Check it out if you'd like to. But yeah, we've kind of been on the research and policy side, like since I've started with them, we've been diving into IP quite a bit. In 2019, we did a survey of Indigenous businesses, kind of just gauged their engagement with IP. In that, we found that 1 in 5 hold IP, which kind of tracks with the average Canadian, I guess you could say. 3 in 5 use traditional knowledge in their business, but only 20% of those people have protections for it, which can lead to many issues. The biggest being financial loss. There's so much like missed revenue that comes from that. A loss of cultural meaning as well, like having this traditional knowledge taken from the cultural context in which it originates is honestly detrimental to Indigenous peoples and incredibly harmful. And just legal challenges and costs associated with that. But yeah, I'll turn it over to the other panelists.
Tia. Hello.
Did I do it right?
Bazoo.
Just once I would like to go to one of these and have that like headset thing. And then I'll just talk like this the whole time. It'll look really cool.
There's usually dancing involved when you have those, right, Margot?
Yeah, if somebody wants to hit the lights, maybe we can move into the dancing portion. So Tanse Tia Graham Nitsigasin Sigip Sigaiga Nuchinia. My name is Tia Graham, and I'm from the beautiful community of Waterhen Lake First Nation in Treaty 6 territory. Things that you would want to know about me. I have a beautiful son. He is gorgeous, and he knows it. That's the problem. He is 4. He's going to be 5 next month, and that kid has truly saved and changed my life in so many ways. And of everything I've accomplished in life, that's definitely the thing that I'm most proud of. I used to want to be a YouTuber at one point, and I started a little makeup channel. And every time I tell this to people, I'm like, I immediately have to go sit down and make sure my thing is private, because I really hope no one ever finds it. And I guess, like in recent years, I'd spent most of my career being a counselor and working in social work. And in recent years, I've found myself to be kind of what you would call an intrapreneur. So I'm working in part of that innovation ecosystem to support Indigenous entrepreneurs all across Saskatchewan. So I have to learn all the lingo. I have to learn how to operate in those spaces in order to provide the best supports possible to those who I serve. So in my day job, I'm the Director of Innovation for the Powatsikewagimik Innovation Collective. Powatsikewagimik is the Plains Cree word for the lodge to support those who dream. And when we started this project in 2021, we really knew that we wanted to support Indigenous innovation and entrepreneurship at a grassroots level, but we didn't want to just assume what it was that our communities and our entrepreneurs needed. So we started with a lot of focus groups and reaching out to those students and entrepreneurs, our FSI and chiefs, people who had been kind of operating in that space. And we developed all of our programs and services based on their feedback so that we could really make sure that we were helping them to be successful. So some of our key program offerings are the Mioskimin Innovation and Entrepreneurship Applied Certificate Program that we wrote from the ground up, and it teaches you how to start a business, but how to do that from an Indigenous lens and incorporate traditional values and teachings. I brought 2 of our students, Tristan and Austin, from that program. They're at the back there with me today. We also have the Greg Yule Fellowship Program, which we're running our first round of. And I've brought Marlon and Shyla from that group as well, who are sitting at our back table. Shyla has to fly home in a bit, so I think she's just packing her bag at the moment. But if you get a chance to say hi before she goes. So that's how we support those businesses that have been in operation for 2 or more years and are really needing help scaling up and growing their business and taking it to the next level of success. We also do micro grants and wraparound supports to address financial barriers for Indigenous entrepreneurs. And then we do a bunch of tech stuff. So we have the Maker Lodge, which is our Indigenous spin on a traditional maker space, where we started with sewing machines and ribbon skirt workshops and branched out into 3D printing and all kinds of film equipment. We call our storytelling equipment, and we actually have Saskatchewan's first LED volume wall, which is really exciting. So we can create those opportunities for our students to show up in industry wherever they want to show up and not where industry tells them that they need to show up. And then Mobile Maker Lodge. So travel to communities, deliver technology so that people can participate from the comfort of their community with that infrastructure. And Dreamers and Doers STEAM camps. There's probably more things that I'm forgetting. I'm very thankful that Diane's also on our advisory council for that project. So we get to work with her closely. So if you want to chat more about any of that and how we're operating in Saskatchewan, then I'm happy to continue that conversation after as well.
Benjamin, Anine, Buzu.
I feel like an imposter in a STEAM panel like this. My name is Ben Tonche. I am CEO of AgriTech North. Also, Fabian is here, who's COO, Chief Operating Officer. We are the first year-round grower of fresh produce in northwestern Ontario. We are a beneficial corporation that's only recognized in British Columbia currently, so we're a BC Corp operating in Ontario. We commit to social goods in our articles of incorporation, and B Corp certification allows a third-party auditing process that ensures that we're doing the social goods we claim to. Social enterprise is simply a marketing term. There's no one actually checking social enterprises to make sure they're doing the social good they are claiming to. B Corps and B Corp certification is different. It's the only corporate structure other than a charity that has an audit trail. So that's why we chose that structure. We did over a year of market research and business planning before targeting what was missing to solve food security in the north, and that's local production, which is why we started with a farm that's year-round. We're also a living lab research and development center. After building this first-of-kind facility, we quickly realized that these facilities don't do what manufacturers claim. The costs don't meet break-even points with the revenue able to be generated through food, especially in a rural community where you don't have the luxury of monocropping lettuce. And so you're growing a lot of things suboptimally, and as a result, you take a revenue hit to meet your market demand. And even if we were monocropping, it still wouldn't hit break-even. So our goal is to lower the cost of production to reach a break-even point and to achieve net zero energy independent year-round growing within off-grid Indigenous communities. Our 4 pillars of our B Corp that we commit to improving is food sovereignty, where we intend to lower the price of food in far north Indigenous communities by at least 25%. It's a lofty goal. It's going to take us a while to get there. And also sustainability is the second pillar. Third pillar is education, and fourth pillar is workplace diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have a very diverse staff group, more than 75% 2S LGBTQ, 50% gender diversity. We also have we have elderly and youth, so we have intergenerational staff as well. So there's a lot of cultural sharing that happens on site. I'm Métis, as you can probably tell by the sashes. I've traveled to the east and west coast, much like a traditional Métis would, as opposed to being landlocked, which is why I have 2 sashes. The black sash is from British Columbia, and the red sash is from this region. We also presented our business on Bears Lair, which is the first Indigenous business competition that's televised, and we are the inaugural season winners of 2023. So that's what these gifts are from, is to guide us in our journey forward, to help us be successful in our mission. And as we'll get into in the questions, traditional knowledge and Indigenous knowledge plays a significant role in our direction as an organization and what came to be those social goods that we committed to. Thank you.
All right, Chi miigwech, and again, Chi miigwech means very big thank you. And I'm glad that you were. I was going to say, should we talk about what you brought with you there on the table? But we'll talk a little bit more about how does traditional knowledge show up for us, right? And so, I think for me, an Indigenous approach is to be very centered in relationship and to be centered in relationality. And so, understanding who you are is very, very important. And I know as Indigenous folks, we're not the only culture that does it, but for sure we do it, which is we go around saying, so who are you? Where are you from? Not so much what do you do, but who are you, right? And so starting this way, I think makes sense. So you have a little bit of an idea of who we are. You have a little bit of an idea of where we're coming from. So we're going to ground ourselves in the conversation of today, which is an intellectual property conversation. And I do want to, the earlier panel, Robert had said, and I wrote it down because I just thought, okay, that really nails it. And I think, it's something that we're all in this room for. But he said, I want to solve this problem, and this is how I want to solve this problem. And so that grounded me a lot to say, okay, this is where this conversation sort of centers around. And so that's what we're going to talk about. But I also wrote down a lot of words that I was hearing that I know we talked about, or maybe the difference. And so the idea of patents, the idea of protecting before sharing or instead of sharing, competition, monopoly, infringements. And that isn't exactly the kind of conversation we had when we were talking about intellectual property. So one of the first questions I do want to ask each of you is, how is it that you think about or define intellectual property? Like, what does that mean to you? And from your particular lens, from your particular Indigenous experience. So maybe I'll go to Tia first, and then we'll move it around.
All right. So intellectual property, in my opinion, doesn't really coincide with who I am as an Indigenous person, because when we have knowledge, one of the first things I was ever taught as an Indigenous child was to have knowledge is to share knowledge, and the responsibility that comes with that, and to make sure that as you're moving up or advancing, that you're also gifting back to other people in your community. So when you come into the entrepreneurial landscape or the innovation landscape, that concept that you now have something that you have to protect from the world instead of sharing with the world is very polar opposite to who we are. So that concept of intellectual property isn't something that we really had growing up. So yeah, I guess intellectual property, that intangible aspect of your business that you need to protect, because that's the lucrative piece that everybody wants, but it's kind of not who we are, if that makes sense. Yeah, so it's kind of different because it doesn't really work to protect that traditional knowledge, which we'll get into in a little bit. But it's the essence of your business that's lucrative and that makes you successful in terms of a Western framework.
And I know Ben and I were just talking at lunch there, thinking about, like, does the product that you have, and I sort of put a little bit air quote around that to a little bit, but does the product you have change your thinking about this concept of intellectual property? So Ben, what's your views on intellectual property?
We have 4 different main tracks currently of specifically patentability, plus our trademarks and such. We gift openly to Indigenous communities, Indigenous peoples. We wrote a food sovereignty mandate for Grand Council Treaty 3 that was unanimously passed in last year's spring session. And all of the technologies we intend to patent aren't to sell or create a monopoly that will bind Indigenous peoples to that solution, but rather are intended to protect gifting of that solution to Indigenous communities from Western society, which intends to take it and patent it, which would limit us from being able to gift it. So really we see the Western idea of intellectual property as a shield from Western society to continue to contribute and give back to Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities, all our relations, in a way that won't also potentially be a disclosure that will be taken advantage of by some other agency or people. Yeah.
And Cody, you started us off, just getting right into it. So, but again, tell us like what your thoughts are around what does intellectual property mean to you?
Yeah, for sure. Guess I should have prefaced it, like after that IP survey that we did, we've held about 4 roundtable engagements now, I want to say, with Indigenous entrepreneurs. The first was in Vancouver, then we went to Lethbridge, Alberta, Winnipeg in November, where I got to meet Sylvia and Ben. And then just last week, we were in Calgary. So at all of those, I think we spoke to about 20 Indigenous businesses at each. But like for me personally, it kind of comes down to like, at least from an Indigenous worldview, like you can't really own the land. Like people steward the land, that type of stuff. And it's honestly the same with our knowledge. Like you can't own that knowledge. Like sure, you can steward it, be responsible for it. It gets passed down through teachings, all that kind of stuff. But no one's really supposed to be owning that, in our view. With that being said, like, talking to all these businesses, like, most are more familiar with the types of IP, like trademark, patents, copyrights, and IP itself. Like, they really haven't heard about the term, and it largely, I'd say they don't jive with it too much. Like personally, in some ways, it's just, there's many barriers that Indigenous businesses face, and IP can honestly just become another hoop that they have to jump through. There's a lot of costs associated with it, a lot of time commitments, as I mentioned earlier, harm that can be associated with it. But at the same time, it's also another tool in the box. So like about that 40% of Indigenous businesses that I mentioned earlier that don't use traditional knowledge in their business still find significant value in using IP and commercializing it and protecting their innovations, all of those kinds of things. It's just for that part that are using traditional knowledge, it's probably not the best way to protect it, in my view. And there's a lot of potential to recognize Indigenous laws, protocols, ways of doing things. The technical terms, sui generis rights. But yeah, and I mean, I don't want to ramble on, but there's a lot of aspects of the IP framework that don't really coincide with the way that we do things like disclosure, the things entering public domain. Like when Indigenous knowledge enters public domain, that's not, honestly, it's not right. Like, just when you, as I said before, when you pull it out of that cultural context, it loses almost all meaning, and that's the only way it's supposed to be transmitted. So all of this Indigenous knowledge, like it should really be staying in its own Indigenous domain. And if it has hit public domain, there should be effort to bring it back, I'd say. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, and this is why you're here. You're meant to ramble on. That's why we've given you a mic, because we like your ramble. And yeah, so I'm going to get into this idea of what is traditional knowledge. And I think that to me is a little bit of where there might be some of the tension, right? Or maybe some of the different kinds of concepts, or where the concepts stem from. And this idea that, you know, as Indigenous people, we've been leaning into traditional knowledge and trying to have resurgence of traditional knowledge to help us solve the problem, or this is how we want to solve the problem, is with our knowledges. Yet we have a value system that's about gifting, that's about sharing, that isn't about, it's not that capitalistic sort of hoarding of, you know, things, and then whoever has the most at the end wins. Like that isn't the idea. And how a lot of our, the idea of your, how you're viewed in the community and how you're regarded is by how much you give away, actually. Now, that's a different concept of philanthropy, because we don't have the accumulation part of that first before you give away. It's no, you give all the time. And if everyone's always giving, then you can live in a secure world knowing you will always receive, because people are always giving. And so this, again, this accumulation part is not part of the giving. So when we think about the traditional knowledge, and I think what's been touched upon with all three of you, is the idea of, is this something you're supposed to own and lock down and patent and try to stop anyone else from using it before you can monetize it, right? I think that's where the tensions sometimes lie. So I want to go to that question, like what is traditional knowledge to you, or how are you using it in what you're doing? And maybe I'll go over to Ben, and we'll start over here.
Make me go first on the hard question. Traditional knowledge to me is a group of a cultural norm among a group of people. For Indigenous people particularly, it has to do with connection with geography, all living things, all my relations, that guide our principles, our priorities, and our way of life. And that works its way into our organization, for example, through our commitments, and following through on those commitments. Our return, I was gone for 20 years acquiring education and experience from my home territory, and came back rooted in ancestral calling to give back to those who helped raise me, give back to the communities that helped make me who I am, and not leave all that behind me and waste all of the precious gifts that my lineage has offered to me, right? Even the act of returning is rooted in Indigenous values, and then all of the commitments we've made on top of that, you know. And our for example, our logo includes the Métis symbol, the infinity symbol. So it's also worked our way into the branding, which is then worked into a trademark, right? So it's communicated, but in a indirect, not necessarily obvious to those who don't know Indigenous knowledge way, where it's not calling itself out.
Cody, do you want to weigh in there?
Yeah, sure. Kind of building on what Ben was saying, like, I'd say there's also a distinction between traditional knowledge in the broader sense and then Indigenous knowledge. So in the international scheme, like, any culture can have traditional knowledge. If you're Irish, you might have some traditional knowledge emerging out of that. If you're Welsh, you might have some traditional knowledge emerging out of that. But in this specific context, like talking about traditional knowledge, like, to me, it's just, Indigenous knowledge is just our knowledge. There's nothing special about it. It's our cultural knowledge that's been transmitted across people. But with that being said, it's difficult to define. It, like Ben was saying, it comes from different locations, different groups, like various types. There's also various categories of it. So in my view, there's two very broad categories that it would fall under. You have Indigenous traditional knowledge and then Indigenous cultural expressions. So traditional knowledge can kind of be broken down into technical Indigenous knowledge, which kind of deals with land-based knowledge, knowledge of sacred plants, migration patterns, those types of things. And then there's the theoretical side of things. So like the 7 grandfather teachings, the 4 R's, the Tugulink, which is like a Mi'kmaq concept about sustainable development. Like all of those things are philosophical traditional knowledge. And then with the cultural expressions, that's things like, those are, well, it's in the name, are expressions of culture. It's dance, art, song, all those types of things. But then there's also several tiers of that knowledge too. So not in terms of like their validity, but in terms of how they originate. So you have it originating at like the broadest level with linguistic and regional groups. Then it comes about for communities. It can come about through families, elder-mentee relationships. Like there's so many different types of it and so many, I'd say, different protocols to be aware of when dealing with it. Yeah, well, to me personally, it's really just like water. So all water is H2O, comes in various forms. It can be solid, liquid, or gas. Sound like a bit of a scientist here. But and then there's various other shapes it can come in depending on the glass. You know what I mean? It can be a vase, it can be all those types of things. That is traditional knowledge. Yeah.
And Cody makes a good point about, you know, there is contemporary knowledge and then there's historical knowledge. And some of our knowledge, I would just happen to have the privilege of sitting with Meday elders last week, and they talk about knowledge that's been around for like 65 million years, which is sort of a real, and the idea that we don't own that knowledge, right? We're caretakers and we have responsibility to that knowledge, but we don't own it. So I think it was Sylvia talking about the X and trying to, like, how do you how do you own something that's common, if you will? Yeah. So Tia, what do you think?
I feel like I got the lucky spot on this one because I just get to say ditto to these guys, basically. So I'm the first generation in my family to not attend residential school. So yeah, and it's a lot, right? And I'm extremely fortunate that growing up, I was able to pick berries with my cookum and sit in a bear sweat that she owned, and that I was able to lay under the trees in the Sundance Lodge, even though you weren't really supposed to be in there. And I was able to grow up with a lot of my culture and with a lot of my traditions, and those values are the essence of who I am and how I walk forward in this world. So that traditional knowledge, in its sense to me, it makes up who I am and how I carry forward in everything that I do in daily life. When I was applying to be the director for my project, they asked me, how do you ensure that you are going to carry forward traditional values and make sure they're incorporated into the programs that you develop? And I was like, I'm an Indigenous creator in like anything that I do. Like those values of Sigituin, love, and reciprocity, I don't know how to say that one in Cree, Wakotuin, community, those traditional values that we're instilled with, they are a part of who we are. And everything that we develop, everything that we move forward with, they're ingrained in everything that we deliver and how we show up in this world. But it is also very complex. So thinking about a lot of the things that I've done, we've done a lot of work with First Nations communities and 360 cameras, for example. So I'll go out and I'll deliver a STEAM camp in a community in collaboration with their local elders and their local knowledge keepers, because even though I've been raised in my tradition, when I'm coming into your territory, your values aren't necessarily the same as mine. We're gonna have a lot of those roots that are similar, but a lot of those teachings that come at the forefront in your community are gonna be different. So, side note, when you engage with Indigenous people, consult with multiple. It's not just because you've talked to one Indigenous person and they gave you the go-ahead that it's okay to do that somewhere else. But when we're engaging with these First Nations communities, we've done a lot of work where we've tried to merge culture with technology. So 360 cameras was a really easy way that I could do that. So as we were at camp, we've done things where we've built teepees and talked about traditional teepee teachings around a 360 camera. And then we have that footage now that we're able to put on VR headsets. And it's one of the things that I get asked all the time is like, what is your goal with sharing it? And my goal is never to share it. If you come into the Maker Lodge, I'll let you see clips of it. I've like purposefully omitted any of the teaching aspect of that, because there is still that component of being an Indigenous person where you have to earn that knowledge and you have to earn those teachings. And it's my job as an Indigenous woman who's supporting Indigenous communities and Indigenous entrepreneurs and Indigenous students to protect them and the ways that they engage within their community and making sure that they don't become exploited. Because if I did share that, that would be lucrative. Like how cool is that, right? But it's not my information or my knowledge to share. So while we're incorporating it into a lot of our programs, we're also thinking about how not to incorporate it into some of the things that we deliver. So it's kind of two-sided. I love the way your mind works. And you've thought of 8 million things. I'm like, yes, to all of it. So yeah, I don't know.
So we're getting down to our time here. I think, again, I was just so jazzed when I had the conversation with these guys, and I thought, oh, we need like a whole day on this. But just to give you a little tiny glimpse that this concept of intellectual property might be a little bit different for different audiences, and particularly for Indigenous folks. But I will say that which is where we're going to go next, if we were to think about centering indigeneity or centering Indigenous perspectives, experiences, value systems, knowledge systems in this IP conversation, what might that look like, or how might we then assemble the tools and resources to that would be better suited? And I will always say that centering indigeneity works for everyone, not just Indigenous people. I think we're in so many crises right now, and I think, okay, some knowledge systems have had their day. It is time for other knowledge systems to come forward and perhaps take a crack at this, and perhaps we can find some other solutions if we were to really dive into other knowledge systems. So yeah, so that, and I feel like we also, because I think I know where we went with this, I had hoped that we might spend a little bit more today, and I loved how, Sylvia, one of your closing comments was, that's done through agreements, and then it was like, okay, that's a wrap. And we didn't, like, and so the idea of having more of a conversation about how do we reach those agreements, because there's a lot of conversation around how do you lock it down and protect it, but then how might we get to a different place if we're in relationship and if we're having more emphasis on this agreement side of it. So the idea is, what might we need, whether it's similar or different, in this intellectual property framework, if you will, that would support either Indigenous business, and again, I think it might support more than Indigenous businesses, but, and I'm gonna go, Cody, let's go with you first.
Awesome.
You avoided the eye contact, so I went with you first. These guys were looking at me.
I feel like I had the longest answer, to be honest, but I'd say there's kind of 4 angles to addressing it. So the first is kind of using what's already out there kind of creatively. So I won't say Ben's example for him, but like inserting, like, you can use contract clauses to protect your traditional knowledge. You can use NDAs. I'm not really in a place to speak about the language there. I'm not a lawyer by any means. There's certification marks that you can use. The Igloo tag trademark is a huge one that's been used for years. There's also geographical indications. One of our members, Bruce Hardy with my group, he's investigating using that to protect wild rice harvesting practices in like different provinces, so Manitoba being one, Saskatchewan, etc. The second would be, you need to like revise the current IP framework and really just look at what's already out there and being done in other jurisdictions. So one of the calls in the National Indigenous Economic Strategy is doing just that, but you could look at Australia, New Zealand, the US. New Zealand, or Aotearoa, has made significant changes to their trademark and patent acts. The US has the Indian Arts and Crafts Act from 1990. It essentially ensures that any goods portrayed as being made by an Indigenous person are actually being sold as that, like they have to be a member of a state-recognized tribe, etc. Thirdly, I think there needs to be a recognition of sui generis frameworks, I'll call it, but that really just means Indigenous laws, protocols, those types of things. That was never really seated in treaty. And like, from my personal view, I think Indigenous nations have the jurisdiction to be able to protect some of these things on their own. It's just that their laws need to be recognized and in some cases rediscovered. In that, there could be a creation of something called the Traditional Knowledge Institute, really just needing to empower Indigenous businesses, communities, nations to like have the capacity to develop a coalition, address these things, develop strong processes around it, and yeah, make some change. Really just ensuring more space too, and then I'd say finally on that, like, there's a need to look at what's being done internationally. So the World Intellectual Property Organization, or WIPO, is working on the creation of, I guess, protections for traditional knowledge, a definition of that as well. I think Canada needs to push for a bit more progress on that front, the federal government particularly, and there also needs to be effort to ensure that things that we sign on to internationally don't stop us from protecting traditional knowledge in our context. There's the Indigenous Peoples Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement, which is a shining example, but that needs to be more of the norm, not the exception. Indigenous peoples need to engage in these discussions more, but yeah, I'd say really just to end off my remarks, like, you always hear truth must come before reconciliation, but we can't really share our truth if it's gonna get stolen or co-opted. So we need to protect these things to have actual reconciliation.
I don't
Traditional
wanna go after
protocol
that.
of the chin point.
Yeah. Hard act to follow. So 2 quick points, I guess. One is that for me moving forward, I have to start encouraging some of the entrepreneurs that I work with in terms of how they can start protecting, patenting, trademarking aspects of their business. When we did our initial, because we were partnered with Northforge, so we get to run their ElevateIP program, and when a TIFF came in and ran the first session, we had a bunch of our entrepreneurs in the fellowship who were like, I don't understand all of this intellectual property stuff, and it's not something that I want to be a part of. But we as Indigenous people have to start protecting ourselves because we're operating in a system that is trying to exploit us. So a lot of that information may not be able to be protected by traditional Western, or I guess I should say Western IP frameworks, but we have to start focusing on how to protect those aspects of our businesses that can easily be exploited, and figure out the rest through conversations, through relationship, through events like this, by incorporating a traditional knowledge panel so that we can start sharing that awareness outside of our circles and our communities as well. And I think that that protection comes back to us in that sense as well. So we'll do what we can on our front, but we also need to be willing to have that conversation so that we can shift the narrative of how the ecosystem operates around us and hopefully reduce that kind of exploitive nature on both ends. So very grateful that this was incorporated into the agenda today. I do think this could be like an all-day conversation, even just like our brief Zoom call when we were prepping, like this is a whole thing. But yeah, so being open to starting to explore actually utilizing IP patents. And then this is one of our entrepreneurs. He's Marmar Photography. So thanks. Hopefully you got one where I'm not like, but also just being willing to have conversation with people who hold space for us so that we can create a better world and a better environment for all parties involved.
This is one of your points from our previous discussion I just wanted to bring up, is that seemingly benign interactions between us and others can have unintended consequences. And what I'm really driving at is there's quite a bit of history with academic institutes, for example, where there's overriding principles of how they handle intellectual property, and regardless of what the intentions of a professor or a student are, there are rules at the school that actually collect IP, and anything they author becomes property of the institute, even if the student or the teacher had no idea. That information is still co-opted, and there's a lot of legal suits right now about that, which makes Indigenous people generally very hesitant at this point in time to speak about it, because we first now have to acclimate ourselves to even how to check whether or not it's safe to talk to that person. And because we don't generally even necessarily agree with the IP system structure, it's taking us more time to acclimate to how it works. There have been issues in the past, so we're hesitant. That's just a really important point because that's what's really driving this discussion, I think. But we need more supports that are kind of global protections or national protections, rather. That kind of situation can't actually exist. That there are protections nationally for Indigenous traditional knowledge, where if it is attempted to be co-opted in such a way, it can be clawed back to the community that it originated from and can't be co-opted. We need some structure.
Oh, again, just holding all that. Take a deep breath. I do, again, as we're talking, so many things come to mind, and I muse a little bit about how, really up until around the 1960s-ish, a lot of Indigenous knowledge was straight up outlawed. Like it was against the law for us to practice our culture. And then, we weren't even allowed to leave the reservation systems, and so we were really tucked away and out of sight, to the point where now we're being exploited for our knowledge. Like we've come from there to there. But the exploitation is real, and it does happen for sure. And I feel like the difference is when we're trying to help our communities, the monetization isn't always the biggest driver, although we know we need the money to make things happen for sure. But it isn't sort of the biggest or only driver, right? Whereas when we're in the IP conversation, it feels like that's sort of the thing, is to try to protect the monetization of your product. So how might we have different conversations or some either tangential conversations or something, some other options there. So we are like right down to our time now. Our panel is here for the day, and so I encourage you to strike up conversation, form relationships. They are all attached to really cool, super cool things. You can Google them, you can read more, reach out to them. They have so much more to share with us. So here I am offering them up to you. But you know, there's lots of other conversations that are attached to the IP conversation, and so the whole data sovereignty thing is huge. You talked about data is oil. I thought, yep. So the data sovereignty is huge, and then I was hearing other things about AI and hearing that Canada is the place that has contributed the most to the research around AI, not necessarily the corporate side of it, but the research behind AI. So I wonder about that with Indigenous IP. I think we could be that. So with that, I would like you to show a whole lot of appreciation to our panelists who have all traveled here to Manitoba to have this conversation. But please give it up.
Thank you, Diane. Yes, you can leave your mics there. That's fine. Thank you so much. Thank you, Tia, Cody, Benjamin, and Diane for leading that conversation. That was really, really meaningful. I took a lot of personal notes during that one. And thank you to Joelle and the team at North Forge for setting that up and for making that conversation happen as part of today. That was really unique for a lot of events that I think many of us have been to. So thank you for that. We do have a break right now until about 1:45. If you are